Remembering for some people is, well, hard. That one answer on the test. Or remembering the name of that person that you met last week, or what you ate last week, or for me, pretty much anything last week. Or there's the to-dos that don't get done because I get distracted and do something else, and then I forget to do the thing that I said that I would. And for me, it's almost a family joke that I go back to check all the doors to make sure they're locked after we're in the car because I forgot whether I locked them or not. Remembering for some people is, well, hard. And remembering for me is harder and harder the older that I get. But remembering is not hard for God. I mean, He's God, right? He doesn't forget things. God sees all, He knows all, He remembers to keep every single one of His words and His promises down to the very smallest detail. And we've already seen some of that as we're looking through God's story. So why, when you get to this part in God's story, not once but twice in the very first part of the book of Exodus, you read this. Exodus 2, verse 24. God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And then a couple chapters later, chapter 6, verse 5, God says, Now I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians hold in slavery, and I have remembered my promise. Well, the phrase God remembered there isn't because God forgets. It's actually there for us, the readers of the story, because it appears to us sometimes as if He does. And notice how this phrase, God remembered, here comes after the Israelites groaning. It comes in response to the Israelites groaning. See, by the time of the events of chapter 2 in Exodus, when Moses is born, the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years or so, and God had promised them a people, a land, and rest, and none of that seemed to pan out. Yeah, they'd grown more numerous, but they were slaves, not a nation. And they were living in the land, but they didn't have any land for themselves. Slaves don't have that. And as for rest, well, slaves pretty much have none. To the Israelites, it looked as if God had, well, forgotten them, or perhaps that He wasn't around anymore. And then when the king started a genocide program to kill all the newborn Israelite baby boys, well, if God was watching over them, the Israelites certainly didn't see it. Now, there was a glimmer of hope in the beginning of chapter 4 when adult Moses shows up, and adult Moses told the Israelites that God was going to rescue them. He was going to deliver them from Egypt, from slavery. But then when Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," he didn't. And Pharaoh just made the Israelites' lives harder. And again, they grumble and complain, and they wonder whether or not God has, well, forgotten them, which is not an uncommon reaction, is it? When your trouble or your misery goes on and on and on, and sometimes gets worse and worse and worse, you can't help but wonder sometimes, has God forgotten His promises? Or, even more to the point, has God forgotten me? Let's look into the story of Moses, because I wonder whether in this story of Moses there's some insight about when we're struggling with those sort of questions. Let's dig into that now.
Hello, my name is Moses. My life started out a little strange. As a tiny baby, I was sent down the river in a reed basket to save my life. The Pharaoh's daughter rescued me and raised me as her own. I was educated as an Egyptian, though I was a Hebrew. I escaped into the desert after defending a fellow Hebrew man. Well, there, God spoke to me from a burning bush. He told me to rescue his people. God used me to bring plagues on Egypt. I led God's people through the Red Sea and saved them from the Egyptian army. Trusting God was not easy, but he used me to set his people free. I'm Moses, and this is my story.
So Moses is not born into what I'd call an ideal situation. His people are slaves, all of them. In fact, slavery is all that anyone's ever known. Born a slave, die a slave. Born to a hard life, die from a hard life. That's pretty much all anyone knew, and that's all they had to look forward to. And while you still know that the stories and the promises of God are there, and you still repeat them and study them and learn them, it seems to you as if God has forgotten you after all those years. Forgotten you and forgotten your people. Yeah, the words are still repeated, but they seem hollow and empty to most. And most of the people are thinking, well, if God hasn't acted by now, will he ever? I mean, God's people here are really stuck in a bad situation. And maybe you've been there too. Your stress, your struggle, your suffering, your trouble goes on and on and on, and you want it to change and you need it to change, but you just don't see how it's going to. And then for the Israelites, it got even worse. Right? The king then started a genocide program. He says, kill all the Israelite baby boys, Moses included. And God seems even farther away, if that's possible. And all his promises to watch over and take care of his people seem, more and more remote. And then you read this very interesting action by the people of Israel. I'm reading from Exodus 2, verse 23. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. Their cry for help. I mean, even after 400 years, and they felt helpless and they felt hopeless and alone and stuck in a bad situation that kept getting worse, they still kept on praying. And it's important, I think, to see that for several different reasons. Prayer is sort of a backhanded admission that even in all the trouble, that God is still there. Even in the pain, that God is still there, even if he can't be seen. Otherwise, why would you pray? Praying also adjusts your attention, from the cruddy stuff here, it adjusts your attention upward. Away from something beyond the immediate situation that you're struggling with. And the third thing that happens is prayer gives you hope to hang on there. Hope to hang on until help arrives, which in God's timing is usually, just in time, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that we can learn from this story here. When you're stuck in a bad situation, and you don't see how it can change, maybe you should consider the same sort of action that the Israelites had even after 400 years. When you're stuck in a bad situation, you don't see how it can change, just keep on praying. Keep on praying until God's help arrives. In fact, where do you need that right now? Take out your device and think about your life and just jot a few of those things down, and either in the list function or in the memos, and then or in the notes, and then simply refer to that list during the course of this week and pray about that daily. Bring that list to God, because that helps you remember that God's out there, even when it seems like he's forgotten his promises, and even when it seems like maybe he's forgotten you. So God's just-in-time answer to the Israelites' prayers? Exodus 2:24, next sentence, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. The people prayed, and God remembered his promise. And when it says here that God remembered, it doesn't mean that he ever forgot, because he doesn't. What it means there is he's about to act. In fact, if you follow the story, God has already begun to act. It's just that the people don't even know it or see it yet. But we learned something looking through the story of Joseph, didn't we? That in everything, God is working. That in everything, God is working toward our good, even when we don't see him, even when we don't know how. And that's what's going on here. So even before Israel saw what was going on, God had already been working behind the scenes to act, to rescue, and to save them, to keep his promises. So what God was doing is, in the time when the law said that he and all the other little baby boys would be killed, Moses was born. And God was working there to make sure that Moses wasn't killed. And because Moses was going to be the one who was going to be the rescuer, the deliverer, the one who God would use to set his people free. And God kept Moses from being killed even after he was born. You read in chapter 2 the events there, and you can see God's hand in all of it. First, his mother was able to hide him for 3 months. And then when that wasn't feasible anymore, well, they made this little basket and they set that into the Nile and they trusted Moses into the hands of God. And God guided that so it ended up where Pharaoh's daughter was. And apparently she wanted some kids and didn't have any. So she adopts little baby Moses, this Hebrew baby who was supposed to be killed, and raises him in Pharaoh's palace. And again, God's there watching over Moses and keeping him safe every step of the way. Then Moses grows up, and years later, God's saving Moses again when Pharaoh had an APB out for him for killing an Egyptian. And God guided Moses to the land of Midian, where he ended up getting married and raising a family and becoming a shepherd. And as far as we can see, the Israelites actually knew none of this. They didn't know, even before they voiced that prayer, that God was watching over them. That God was watching over them and working behind the scenes to shape the rescuer that he would send. Now, do you think there's something we can learn from that? When life is hard and it looks like to us that God's forgotten his promises? Well, what this tells me is that he won't. He won't. He can't. God can't not be who he is. God's always loving, always caring, always protecting, always faithful, always true, always watching over us, always keeping his promises, and always working, even in things that we can't see, toward our ultimate good. The timing, however, well, that's not always something we can see or know. Again, the people of Israel had no idea that Moses was coming. In fact, I think they'd almost given up hope for any sort of a rescuer. And Moses, well, he didn't know that this version of Moses was coming either, but God did. In fact, God was always there, watching over his people, watching over Moses, working behind the scenes to prepare both of them for this particular moment in time. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life in Pharaoh's palace, where he learned, I believe, most of the leadership skills that he was going to need when he was leading his people. And he spent the next 40 years in the deserts of Midian, learning things like, well, hard work and perseverance through hardship, and yes, humility. All of that to get him ready for this particular encounter with God in Exodus chapter 3, when God comes to Moses and tells Moses, Moses, you're going to lead the people out of Egypt. Let's look at that a little closer.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Now there's a lot there in that encounter with Moses and God. But I want to focus on two big things that I think are really important if you want to see that even when life is uncertain or confusing and not turning out the way that you pictured it, that still God hasn't forgotten his promises and God hasn't forgotten you. Now the first thing I notice here in chapter 3 is that Moses wasn't even looking for God. He was just going about life much as he had for the previous 40 years or so after running from Egypt and settling in Midian. But then Moses sees this strange sight, a bush that's burning, but doesn't seem like it's burning up. So, well, how long does it take a bush to burn up? I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, longer? It depends, I suppose, on the type of bush that it is. But in order to see that the bush didn't burn up, here's what Moses had to do. Moses had to stop and watch for a while, to stare at that burning bush, to notice, hey, that bush isn't burning up. And I think that's what God was waiting for. I think God was watching and waiting and wanting Moses to get these words, slow down. I think he was wanting Moses to slow down and take time out of his daily routine, to take a moment away from the job to see this strange thing and what it was all about. And when Moses slowed down, that's when God went into action and revealed to Moses that he hadn't forgotten his promises and that he hadn't forgotten him. And to me that suggests something. It doesn't prescribe it like it's a command or something, but I think it suggests that if we want to see that God is still around, we might need to find ways to, slow down a bit. To slow down a bit, to actually listen to God. And as we're listening to God, then to seek his presence and let him speak to you and work in you and let his power transform you. And that's a real challenge in today's world, isn't it? Slowing down. So take a moment to, think about this. Where do you need to slow down right now so you can see that God is still there? And then ask yourself, what might need to be unscheduled so that you can do that? So has God forgotten his promises? Has God forgotten you? You know, slowing down long enough to listen to him will help you remember that he hasn't. That God remembers his promises and that he remembers you and that he's watching over you and keeping you safe. You know what else will help you remember that? Remembering who God is. Remembering who he reveals himself to be. And that is the second big thing that I see here in Exodus chapter 3. Let me read to you this encounter between God and Moses starting at verse 13. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." That is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." So Moses asks, God, what's your name? And God says, "I am." And Moses is like, "Oh, right, God, that really makes things clearer. Can you give me a little more information here?" And God says, "Well, okay, I am who I am." And think Moses is a little confused there? Are you a little confused in hearing that? I mean, how can we know God or trust that he's going to keep his promises if he keeps speaking in riddles like this? Well, it's not really a riddle here. I don't want to bore you with the technical details of the Hebrew, but there is actually something significant going on here in the way God reveals himself in his name. In a culture where names really meant something and they, in effect, were a reflection of a person's character, God here reveals his name as a verb, as an action word. So what God's doing there is he's saying, I want you to see that I'm the God who's active in the world. I'm the God who's active in the lives of his people. I'm the God who's active in your life, whether you see it or not. That's how I want you to know me. The God who loves you, who cares for you, who's watching over you, who has the power to keep his promises. That's all in the name there. Power? Well, I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. That's one way you can take that phrase there. In other words, I'm the one who can't be controlled or manipulated or boxed in. I'm the one you can't shape or mold to fit your preconceptions. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. Also, I am the one who causes to be what will be. In other words, I'm the one who creates. I'm the one who acts in history. I'm the one who's holy and powerful and awesome. Moses, take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground here. That's the power side of God. And it's important to know that God has that kind of power in order for us to deal with the stuff that we're facing. But I think it's even more important to know God's heart for us. More important to know God's heart, especially when we're questioning or confused or struggling to see that God's keeping his promises, well, because our life is just, well, hard. But that's in God's name too. We see God's heart in his name as well. He's saying, I am the one who exists. I am the one who is present, not absent, who's near, not far away. I am the one who is, and I am the one who is with you faithfully wherever you go. The one who walks with you on this path that I've placed before you. The one who's never going to let you face any difficult or dangerous or seemingly insurmountable parts of this journey all by yourself. I'm the one who rescues you. I'm the one who protects you. I'm the one who saves you. Moses, remember your own history? Why do you think you're even alive? It's not by coincidence. Moses, I was watching over you. I was watching over you, and I was watching over your people, and I was the one who was shaping you for this moment in time, so that according to my promise, you would be the one to set my people free. And I'm the one who keeps his promises, no matter what, no matter how long it seems to take. What did I tell you? I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'm the God of Abraham, who for a long, long time and had some ups and downs and doubts, and it didn't look like I was going to keep my promise, and sometimes he didn't believe, but I kept my word. And I kept it to Isaac, even though it didn't look sometimes as if it was going to go anywhere. And I kept it to Jacob, even though he didn't deserve it. Yet I kept my promise anyway. I'm the God who remembers. The God who remembers his covenant, the God who remembers and keeps his promises, the God who remembers you. So, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. God says, even if times are scary or uncertain or confusing, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to lead you. I'm going to help you lead. I'm going to help you serve. I'm going to help you do these significant things. And I'm not going to let my enemies destroy you. I'll see to that. So don't be afraid. I'm the God who is and who was and ever will be. And I remember. I remember my promises, and I remember you. Now Moses, well, he didn't really want to go back to Egypt, but all the while, God had been watching over his people, and God had been watching over Moses. And from his birth till now, God had been preparing Moses for this moment in time. And so, at God's call and at God's command, Moses, this somewhat reluctant leader at this point, he leaves the relative safety of Midian, and he heads back to Egypt. Now, what happened next? Well, we're going to see that in the part of the story that we're going to get into next week. Just like here, what we're going to also find is a lot more about God than it is about Moses. For now, just hold on to this. When life's hard and when it's confusing and when you're stuck in one of those spots where things are just staying stuck or maybe getting worse and worse and worse, and you're wondering whether God's keeping his promises or whether God's remembering you, well, remember this story of Moses. And as you remember that, remember that God doesn't forget. God remembers. He doesn't forget his promises, and he doesn't forget you. God remembers. He never, ever forgets his people, and he's always, always, always true to his word, whether we see his timing or not. And God is always working behind the scenes, even when we don't see it, because, well, nothing's too hard for God to do. And at just the right time, God acts. At just the right time, God comes to the rescue. That's what it means when it says God remembers, that God's about to act. Now, sometimes, again, it is really hard for us to see that when the struggle goes on and on and on. But remember this story. This story reinforces, well, that's true. It's true. So hang on and hang in there and hang on to God's word and have hope. Because God guards and protects and watches over you. He remembers. And Psalm 121, well, it invites you to remember that.